Hey there, Bandits here with another Path of Exile guide, going back to our roots today with an Arc Witch build, only this time it's not a standard elementalist but an occultist. In the latest expansion, Arc received a gigantic 50% overall damage buff, and that's on top of the massive increase for cast speed mods on items and the new amazing Eldritch crafting system. So we obviously had to revisit this classic build, and the result is pretty damn awesome. Now, everybody probably knows just how amazing Arc is for clearing. You don't need to aim, it jumps across the screen, it can go around corners, it can loop behind you, and it always feels great to play. And when you combine all that with the occultist explosions, you get this extremely satisfying one-shot, clears the entire screen playstyle. That works incredibly well for legions, blights, expeditions, delirium maps, delve, basically any type of content that has lots and lots of enemies clumped or stringed together. In the past, Arc Witches have been rather squishy, relying more on killing stuff before they kill you and keeping a healthy distance between yourself and the enemies. But in this version, I decided to ramp up the tankiness quite a bit, and while you're not immortal or hardcore viable, you should die far less than you'd expect. And that was possible by going low life, which freed up a lot more resources for defenses. The build has a solid energy shield pool, plus a metric ton of armor, immunity to freeze, stuns and shock, reduced damage taken from critical strikes, and a bunch of chance to block both spells and attacks. When it comes to recovering your energy shield, there are multiple mechanics working in parallel. You get Divine Shield, Energy Shield Leech, and Great Regen thanks to Vile Bastion from the Ascendancy. On top of that, whenever you stop taking damage for about 1.5 seconds, your energy shield starts recharging at a rate of almost 7,000 per second. Yep, it's absolutely insane, and can also trigger that on demand using Vile Discipline. Lastly, most enemies, especially bosses, will be sapped if you're playing the build correctly, drastically reducing the damage they're dealing, but I'll explain how that works a bit later. Now, speaking of bosses, Arc is not a particularly amazing bossing skill, but that doesn't mean it's hot garbage either. You'll have no issues killing most high-end bosses, it just takes slightly longer, and you'll see plenty of bossing footage throughout this guide. And unless you're looking for a dedicated bossing character, it's better to have an amazing mapper and a decent boss killer than vice versa. You spend way more time mapping than bossing, so that's where it's better to be more efficient. As for the price, it cost me about 10 to 15x to put everything together and have most of the gear fairly well min-maxed. Now, obviously prices will vary, and you can also save a lot of currency if you're familiar with fossil or eldritch crafting methods. Finally, the build is a really good league starter, relying more on gem levels and passives rather than gear. Evidently, you won't start as a low life build, but rather a hybrid ES life, and transition to low life once you get the necessary pieces, such as Chevron's wrapping. The POE passive tree progression reflects that, but I'll go over all this in the leveling section. All in all, this is a great middle of the road build. It's not as insanely fast as a ranger, but it's not a glass cannon either. It's not the best bossing build out there, but it also doesn't cost an arm and a leg. It's not immortal, but it also doesn't rely on bullshit items like Mage Blood or Squire. A great build to start with and carry on through an entire league as your main. Now, let's talk about the build mechanics and how you're supposed to play it. When it comes to damage, there are several different methods the build uses to reach somewhere around 5 to 7 million DPS against endgame bosses. We're dealing pure lightning damage with a 100% crit chance, or very close to that, which means every single target we hit will be shocked, drastically increasing the damage they take. That level of crit rate is achieved mostly through power charges, up to 8 of them when using a Void Battery wand, which is usually in the range of 20 to 30 Chaos Orbs beyond the first week of a new league. Apart from the base stats of power charges, there are multiple other bonuses we get for each of them, from the passive tree, the Ascendancy, and the timeless jewel Militant Faith with its Inner Conviction keystone. Power charges are generated through the Power Charge on Crit support gem, Disciple of the Forbidden passive, spending mana, and quality bonus on the Assassin's Mark gem. All in all, it takes 2 or 3 hits to get 8 power charges against a boss, or killing a single pack of mobs when mapping. Another means for increasing our DPS is through curses, with the occultist being able to apply 2 of them on each target, in this case Assassin's Mark and either Elemental Weakness or Conductivity. Not only will the curses themselves directly boost your damage, but cursed enemies are also debuffed with Malediction, further increasing any damage they take and reducing any damage they deal. The Arc skill itself also has a very clever design, which dynamically increases its single target damage. It deals 15% more damage for each remaining chain, and you can get up to 10 chains in this build with a level 21 Arc gem, Lightning Mastery, and the Helmet enchant. So extra chains mean not only better clearing, but when fighting a boss that has no adds, Arc deals 150% more damage. And that's without having to swap any support gems, which is usually the case with most other skills. Then we have the very common and cheap Algor Mortis gloves, which say enemies in your chilled areas take up to 35% increased lightning damage, which is a direct 35% more damage multiplier for Arc. Chilled areas are created using Frostblink and with Cold Snap triggered by custom damage taken. Now, obviously you won't be able to consistently create chilling areas everywhere while mapping, but it's quite easy to maintain them against bosses. You just need to Frostblink through the enemy every 5 seconds or so, and you can do that before the fight begins as well. Might sound like a big hassle, but the damage boost is gigantic, and if that isn't enough to convince you, well, you also have a chance to sap enemies in chilled areas, and sapped enemies deal significantly less damage. Two incredibly powerful bonuses provided by these gloves just by using a movement skill or getting hit every now and then. On the defense side of things, the build is a hybrid low life energy shield plus armor. With good gear, you'll end up with over 20k armor in your hideout and close to 50k with Molten Shell and the Granite Flask. For energy shield, again with good gear, you should be sporting an ES pool of a bit over 7000 with multiple ways of recovering it. If you're not familiar with how energy shield recovery works, I'll explain the 3 major ways of doing that. First, there's Energy Shield Leech, which works just like Life Leech, it just recovers Energy Shield instead. We take one small node on the passive tree right above Soul Thief, and that's enough to give us somewhere between 700 to 800 ES leached per second. Then there's the Energy Shield Regen, which again works just like Life Regen. The moment your ES drops below 100%, it kicks in and won't stop until it's back at full. By default, the build doesn't have much regen, but we get quite a bit from Vile Bastion and Divine Shield. Divine Shield is especially efficient considering how much physical damage mitigation we have from all that armor. Lastly, there's Energy Shield Recharge, which is a bit more complicated but also the strongest of these mechanics. It kicks in when you stop taking damage for a certain amount of time, and for this build it's about 1.5 seconds. As for the rate or speed of the recharge, well, with decent gear it's about 6 to 7000 per second. You can also trigger the recharge instantly, ignoring the do not take damage requirement by using Val Discipline. That will be your panic button and act sort of like a life flask for energy shield. Val gems are a 2-in-1 kind of deal with the same gem housing 2 different skills. In this case you have the regular Discipline aura, increasing your energy shield pool, but also Val Discipline, which is an instant ability that triggers the recharge. By this point you probably noticed that I haven't really talked about life stuff. I don't have a life flask and my character's life globe looks weird, as in I have almost 0 HP. Well, that's because the build uses the Prism Guardian Shield with 3 major auras socketed in it, all of them being reserved from life instead of mana. This has several advantages. First, those 3 auras are practically free and you couldn't have otherwise used them on top of all the other auras, at least not without reserving them from life. Then, because our HP is below the 50% threshold, we're considered as being in the low life range, and that allows us to take the Pain Attunement Keystone for a very beefy 30% more spell damage. By getting all this extra DPS, we can afford to spend most of the passives and gear affixes on defenses like Energy Shield and Armor, and since we're using so many auras, passives like Sovereignty or Influence become much more valuable. Now, while leveling through a campaign and low map tiers, you can't go directly with a pure energy shield setup. I've designed the passive tree to be a hybrid of life plus energy shield up to about level 80, and until you transition to pure ES, you need to make sure your gear also has life on it and you're using a life flask. So, to make the switch to energy shield, you'll need all the following: Val Discipline gem at level 15-16 plus, boots and helmet with a decent amount of ES on them, rings and amulet that have flat or percentage increase ES on them instead of life, the Vile Bastion Ascendancy passive for stun immunity, Chevron's Wrapping's body armor to prevent chaos damage from bypassing the energy shield and insta-killing you, and about 20 to 25 passive refund points. When you equip all the ES gear, respec the passives and activate Discipline, you should ideally be sitting above 5000 energy shield. You should also have the Prism Guardian Shield, so you can reserve Wrath, Determination and Zealotry auras from your life pool, otherwise moving to the low life ES setup is not really worth it. While that might sound complicating, leveling up this build is actually pretty smooth and simple. You start off as a witch and up to level 12 you can use Freezing Pulse and then switch to Arc. Around Act 4 you should be getting your first Ascendancy passive, and it revolves around curses. Now, you could manually cast a curse, which is how the peasants do it, or be smart and use the Mark of Submission ring with an elemental weakness curse socketed in it. If you somehow cannot afford the Chaos Orb to buy it, you should be ashamed of yourself and link elemental weakness with blasphemy support, turning the curse into an aura. And as usual, you can find leveling gem setups in the POB under the skills tab. Now, if this is not your first character of the league and you can easily buy some additional leveling uniques, then I recommend getting an early Reverberation Rod and socket Arc in it, add a Berek's Grit as your second ring and an Atsiris Foible or Victario's Acuity for the amulet, then you can go with the classic Wanderlust boots, a Gold Dream helmet and maybe a Tabula Rasa. Now with Tabula, I'd say use only 4 or 5 links early on, as going with a full 6 link will drastically increase the mana cost. And speaking of mana, if you do have issues with that in the first few acts, grab 1 or 2 Enduring Mana Flasks and don't reserve more than half of your mana pool with auras. Finally, here's the passive tree and the order for picking up the notable passives. You'll also find leveling trees in the POB under the tree tab dropdown. As mentioned earlier, up around level 80 the tree is a hybrid life plus energy shield one. Then you respec around 20 passives and switch to a pure energy shield tree. Beyond that, there are 2 things worth mentioning. First, you should get a Thread of Hope unique jewel with a medium ring and socketed below Faith and Steel. It will allow you to grab the Holy Dominion, Divine Judgment and Sanctuary passives without pathing to them. Then on the other side of the tree you should socket a Militant Faith jewel with a flavor text converted by High Templar Dominus. This will transform the existing Ghost Dance Keystone, which is really bad for this build, into Inner Conviction for extra spell damage per power charge. And lastly, for the Bandits Quest, you'll need to kill them all and get the 2 passive points. There are plenty of very good options on the tree that outweigh the bonuses any of the bandits would provide. Moving on to the Ascendancy, the Occultist is currently one of the most balanced options out there for spellcasters, with lots of strong generic bonuses even outside cold or chaos damage. After completing the first lab, grab Malediction. It allows you to apply an additional curse on any target, buffs their effect, and cursed enemies are debuffed to take increased damage and deal less damage. A very strong passive for both defense and offense. Follow that up with Profane Bloom. You can now curse hexproof enemies, and cursed enemies have a high chance of exploding, dealing a quarter of their max life as damage to nearby enemies. When pairing this with Arc's wide coverage, you can easily clear an entire screen with a single cast. Now you obviously won't manually cast a curse on every monster pack, but instead get a curse on hit mod, either on a ring or gloves, but I'll go over this in the gearing section. Third passive, Vile Bastion, is crucial for transitioning to pure energy shield as it provides the much needed stun immunity. You see, the chance to be stunned is based on how much damage you take from a hit as a percentage of your HP. Without stun immunity, you'd be stun locked every time a mob would hit you. On top of that, this passive gives you a stacking energy shield regen buff for each enemy you killed in the past 4 seconds. When dealing with high density maps, it's actually not uncommon to push this to over 100 stacks. Finally, after completing the last labyrinth, get Forbidden Power. An extra power charge and increased damage per power charge are perfect for squeezing out a lot more DPS. You'll also get increased area of effect per power charge, and while that doesn't apply to Arc, it does affect the size of chilling areas created by Frostblink or Cold Snap, increasing the effectiveness of the Algor Mortis gloves. For the Pantheon, the choices are straightforward. For the Major God, go with Soul of the Brine King and immediately upgrade the powers that provide freeze immunity and reduced effect of chill. As for the Minor God, you need to go with Soul of Aberath for reduced duration of ignites and upgrade it as soon as possible to obtain Burning Ground immunity. Searing Exarch maps will be almost entirely covered in Burning Ground, and damage over time effects will interrupt your energy shield recharge. And with that, let's move on to probably the most important part of the build, gems and links. Now, the numbers you'll see for each gem represent level and quality, and in some situations you'll want to keep certain gems at a lower level than max, or quality might be useless for this build, which is why I'll list it as 0. Also, for the 6 link setup, I'm listing the gems in order of their importance, so if you can only get a 5 link, just drop the last gem. So let's start with the main skill, Arc, linked with Spell Echo, Inspiration, Increased Critical Strikes, Power Charge on Critical and Lightning Penetration. Getting a level 21 Arc gem through Corruption should be your top priority here, as that extra level will add an additional chain, which is a huge DPS increase. Now technically you could get a level 21 Val Arc gem, but that's stupidly expensive and not really worth it unless you have literally nothing else left to upgrade. Then we have the auras, and the first group, Wrath, Determination and Zealotry, needs to be socketed in a Prism Guardian unique shield once you transition to a pure energy shield setup. While you're still going with the hybrid life energy shield setup, you should only use Wrath and Determination. Then there's the second aura setup, socketed in your gloves, and it's made out of Val Discipline, Tempest Shield, Defiance Banner and a low level Clarity for some mana regen. Again, if you haven't transitioned yet to Energy Shield setup, then you won't yet be able to activate most of these auras, maybe just Defiance Banner or Tempest Shield. So it should be fairly clear by now how important it is to switch to the ES setup as soon as possible, as that will be a huge jump for both defense and DPS. Next, the Mobility plus Utility setup with Frostblink and Molten Shell linked with increased duration and a low level Arcane Surge. For most people, I'd recommend assigning Molten Shell to the left mouse button so it activates when moving around. Since it's an instant cast, it won't interrupt movement when it triggers. Then you have a custom damage taken setup with a trigger gem at level 5 linked with Cold Snap level 12 and Sigil of Power level 7. After taking a certain amount of damage, this setup will trigger Cold Snap, which creates a chilling area beneath the enemy that hit you, synergizing well with the Algor Mortis gloves. Sigil of Power creates a runic circle on the ground which increases your lightning damage while standing inside it. As you keep casting and spending mana, the sigil gains additional stages, increasing the buff's effect. Now, in practice, you shouldn't be too hung up about standing inside the circle. It's a nice bonus if you can safely stand in that area, but don't risk dying just for that, it's not worth it. Still in this setup, but not necessarily linked with the other gems, add Herald of Thunder for a pretty strong damage buff. It's here simply because there was no other place for it in the other setups. And finally, in your weapon, you have Arcanist Brand linked with Wave of Conviction and Assassin's Mark. Arcanist Brand attaches to an enemy and repeatedly casts the spells it's linked with. Wave of Conviction applies a minus 15% lightning resistance exposure debuff, and the mark significantly increases your crit chance against that target. I only use this against bosses and in any static combat scenarios or small arena fights like Delve Nodes, Metamorphs, Strongboxes, etc. Okay, so now let's talk a bit about gearing. First, you'll find trade links in the notes tab of the POB, and generally I list 3 tiers: basic, mid-tier and best in slot, with price and performance increasing with each tier. For basic tier, I list gear you'll want before switching to pure energy shield, so it will have some life on it as well. There are overall a few major goals you'll have for gearing up this character. First, the obvious, get your elemental resistances capped. The second priority is to get as much energy shield as possible on all your gear pieces except the weapon. The base energy shield on items like boots or helmet is extremely important. For example, a pair of boots with 200 ES will give you about 500 more total energy shield than a pair that has 100 ES. For this reason, you really want pure energy shield items where there's no best in slot unique. Keep in mind that Intelligence also provides energy shield, so it's a very good secondary mod. Finally, you need enough dex and strength to level up gems like Determination or Defiance Banner. Apart from that, it's mostly about DPS, and the best damage mods you're looking for are Cut Speed, Increased Critical Strike Chance, Critical Strike Multiplier, and Flat Lightning Damage for spells. So starting from the top, a basic tier helmet should be a rare one with some life, elemental resistances, ideally on an ES base and maybe some int or chaos resistance. On a mid-tier one, ditch the life and go pure ES, aim for 200 plus energy shield along with resistances and perhaps some int. For base in slot, you want something similar but with close to 300 ES and a +1 chain arc enchant. You can either buy a clean, item level 85 plus Hubris Circlet that already has the enchant on it, or you can get one without and run the lab yourself trying to hit it. In both cases, you can then craft it using essences, fossils or harvest combined with Eldritch Chaos Exalted and Annulment Orbs. And speaking of that, you can also craft Eldritch Implicits. For seeing X-Arc you want Cast Speed, and for the Eater of the Worlds go for Lightning Resistance Penetration. The weapon can be either a wand, a scepter or a dagger with as much cast speed, flat lightning damage to spells, crit multiplier and increased critical strike chance for spells as possible. For mid-tier, a Void Battery is extremely good for this build, and it usually doesn't cost more than 20 to 30 Chaos Orbs after the first week of a new league. At best in slot, you want high rolls for the mods I mentioned earlier and at least +1 level to all spell or lightning gems. It's impossible for me to tell you exactly what's the tipping point where such a weapon becomes better than a Void Battery, because that also depends on the rest of your gear. If you want to upgrade from Void Battery, then the best thing to do is import your character in POB and check if that weapon would provide more DPS. Still, everything you see in this guide was done with a Void Battery, and that's more than enough for the most content. Next, the body armor. Initially you can go with a rare one having 5 links, 80 plus flat maximum life, resistances, ideally on a pure energy shield or hybrid energy shield armor base. From that, you'll need to upgrade to the mandatory chevrons wrappings when you transition to a pure energy shield setup. Look for a non-corrupted one with the highest ES roll you can afford. A few weeks into the league, a 6 link shavs is about 3-4x, while a 5 link is significantly cheaper. Moving on to gloves, on basic ones you want maximum life, resistances, and ideally some attributes like dex, strength or int, same as the body armor on a pure ES or hybrid ES armor base. For mid tier you should get a unique Algor Mortis and look for the ones that have the highest roll for the enemies in your chilling area take increased lightning damage mod. At best in slot you want a pair of corrupted Algor Mortis with either an elemental weakness curse on hit or spells have plus critical strike chance as an implicit. Keep in mind that you need a curse on hit mod either here on the gloves or on one of the rings. These gloves have always been fairly cheap, below 5 chaos orbs, so you can easily buy a bunch and corrupt them yourself until you hit a good implicit. Next up, boots for basic tier, maximum life, 25 to 30 movement speed and as much resistance as you can squeeze in, both elemental and chaos. Any extra energy shield is more than welcome. For mid tier / best in slot you obviously want to switch to a pure energy shield base and you can get over 200 ES on a pair of sorcerer boots. You should also try to get the flat added lightning damage if you haven't killed recently enchant. It's obviously useless while mapping but excellent versus bosses, and that's where you could use more DPS anyway. For Eldritch implicits, the Searing Exarch should be increased action speed, while the Eater of the Worlds should be either cooldown recovery for travel skills or chance to avoid being poisoned. Moving on to your belt, quite like the boots, this is a slot where initially you want to stack up as much life and resistances as possible, including chaos resistance. Then you should upgrade to either a Stygian Vice or a Crystal Belt with high rolls for flat energy shield and resistances. Great secondary mods on this slot are Strength, Flat Armor or Intelligence. Keep in mind that you can also use Catalysts on the belt, either Tempering to boost the defensive mods like ES and Armor, or Prismatic for more resistances. Up next we have the Amulet, a versatile gear piece which is also the best place to stack large amounts of strength and dex. Apart from that, you basically try to get as many damage mods as you can while keeping your elemental resistances capped and ideally positive chaos resistance. Cast speed, crit multiplier, global critical strike chance and increased spell or lightning damage are the most common DPS affixes you should be aiming for. Amulets can also roll flat and percentage increased energy shield, and let's face it, you can never have too much of that. Finally, if you have an empty suffix, then you can craft +1 to minimum frenzy charges for a very good damage boost. Amulets can be anointed by talking with the NPC Cassia and using oils dropped from blight encounters. This way, you can have any notable passive from the tree added to your amulet. For this build, the optimal choice is Tranquility, which significantly boosts both your total energy shield and DPS. A cheaper but significantly weaker alternative for DPS would be Heartseeker, while Arcane Guarding is a decent defense-oriented option. Rings are pretty much like the amulet, and for basic tier, you know the drill, life, resistances, cast speed and maybe crit mods. Once you transition to pure ES, replace life with energy shield mods, while everything else stays pretty much the same. Rings are also a great place for getting any leftover strength or dex you might need, and it shouldn't be too hard or expensive to do that. Apart from that, on one of the rings you really want curse enemies with conductivity on hit if you don't yet have a pair of corrupted Algor Mortis gloves with a curse on hit. And same as with the amulet, if you have an empty suffix, craft that really strong +1 to minimum frenzy charge. Next up, jewels. Apart from the Thread of Hope unique I mentioned in the passive tree section, you also want a Militant Faith timeless jewel with the flavor text converted by High Templar Dominus. Now this jewel will also have 2 random mods on it, and ideally you want something like increased effect of non-curse auras per 10 devotion or increased elemental damage per 10 devotion. Devotion is added on passive nodes present in the jewel's radius on the tree, and you'll end up with a total of 80 devotion. Apart from that, the jewel can replace notable passives in its radius with its own specific passives. However, those are usually trash, so make sure none of the nodes we take there, like Infused or Resourcefulness or Soul Thief, are being replaced. You can use Divine Orbs to re-roll your jewel until you have a good one. Then you should ideally get a Watcher's Eye with at least 2 mods related to the auras the build uses. Since we have no less than 5 different auras, it should be fairly easy and cheap to find a really good one. Finally, on rare jewels you want Energy Shield, flat lightning damage to spells, increased critical strike chance, critical strike multiplier, cast speed, and any missing attributes or resistances. These mods come in a variety of formats, so make sure you use the trade links in the POB. And last but not least, the Flasks. Before transitioning to a pure energy shield setup, you'll obviously need a life flask, ideally a seething or terrified divine life flask of staunching. Basically, you want some instant healing and bleed removal / immunity. Once you do transition, swap that for a basalt flask. Then you want a granite flask for some additional armor, a quicksilver flask for extra movement speed and mobility, and a diamond flask boosting your crit chance. If you can afford it, replacing the diamond flask with a bottled faith will increase your DPS by quite a bit. Last flask should be an enduring eternal mana flask to help with mana sustain while most of your mana pool is reserved with auras. On pretty much all flasks, you'll want a prefix that grants charges when you deal a critical strike, such as doctors or clinicians. For the suffixes, distributed however you can among all flasks, you want bleed removal, ignite removal, reduce effect of curses, and maybe poison removal.
Learn anything new, Exile?